This video is a longer video because we're going to be covering perhaps one of the most important attributes for customizing your own brushes, and that's color mixing within the ink category. This is a very powerful feature in Clip Studio Paint that in essence sets it apart from many other paint programs. It's also a fairly complex feature, especially as you try to figure out how it interacts with other things. So the focus of this video is to just show lots of examples of painting with the different settings to try to help you get a feel for what's going on. Okay, so the first thing that we want to show is that I'm going to brush tip, and I will show that the brush density is already set all the way up, and we don't use pen pressure there for this example. Then we're going to come to the ink area, and that's where you'll see amount of paint and density of paint and color stretch. Notice also that opacity is set all the way to 100 and it doesn't have pen pressure. And also for amount of paint and density of paint, we're not using any pen pressure, just to show how these things work. The other thing is, if you notice the stroke here, you'll see that I've set the gap, and we can see it over here, so that it's spaced out. And the reason is that I want you to see what's happening to each individual dab as we're painting. That's an important thing, especially because of the amount of paint, because when this gap is reduced and you have the dabs very close together, you actually have many layers of paint with one single stroke. And so it can be confusing about what's happening in the color. Okay, with that said, I've just moved the tool properties up so that you can see all the properties that I'm going to be working with. You can see the layers that I'm going to work on here. And all of the different properties, I've just set them so that you can see them. Okay, so just for our reference, I've unchecked color mixing, so we're not using any color mixing at all. I'm going to go ahead and select the layer that has the two tones of color, and I will start here and just draw down, and you can see what happens. It's just the with opacity and density set all the way up, it's just a color that I have for my primary color. No mixing is happening at all. Now this layer, I intentionally have a large part of the screen that is transparent, and so I will draw there, and you see we have the exact same behavior. So first we'll start with the amount of paint and density of paint all the way up, and color stretch all the way down. We'll also be painting on the layer that has full colors on the top and the bottom. Also notice that I have blend set. So I'm going to paint here. And notice what happens is that we're mixing the primary color with the color that's already down. So we see right here that we have a purplish color mixing the blue and the pink. But then it becomes green as we come down to where the yellow is. And so you can see even on this area that's split right between, the dab is mixed exactly with each pixel. Now notice, no matter how many times I go around to different places or what I do, it's always going to mix completely with the underlying color. So now let's compare that to running color. So we'll start with blend, and we show what that looks like. Now let's switch to running color. Notice that the intensity of blur is set to fixed value, and it looks exactly the same. And if I set it here to automatic, it looks exactly the same. So when you have the amount of paint and density of paint all the way up, it doesn't matter which of these other settings you have set. In fact, when I'm painting on a layer that is fully painted, it doesn't even matter what the density of the paint is. So I've turned it all the way down, and you'll see it has the exact same appearance. It doesn't matter about the density. Now let's paint on a layer that has some ink already there, but transparent in other places. So as I lay down the paint here, notice that it does mix with the pink, but it doesn't reduce the opacity or the density in the transparent area. And if I paint back the other way, it doesn't matter which direction I go in. And just like we've seen before, it doesn't matter if I'm using blend or running color. Now let's take a look at what happens when you have some transparency on your layer and you reduce the density of the paint. Now notice right here I'm using running color, and watch what happens. So as I paint here, notice that immediately it starts to use the density to set the color as I draw on this transparent portion. Same thing if I go in the opposite direction. So here is the critical point to think about as you're working with color mixing, and that is the amount of paint really controls a lot about how you're painting on existing colors, whereas density of paint has a lot to do with controlling what happens as you're painting on transparent areas. In fact, watch what happens when I reduce the amount of paint down to 0. I don't paint on the pink layer, but it paints exactly on the transparent area. Same thing if I go in reverse. So as you set these values, it's very important to know where you're intending to use your brush. Are you intending to use it on layers that already have paint on them? Or are you going to paint on a layer that's a transparent layer, like when you maybe paint shades or highlights on top of base colors? So if you're wanting to create a brush that may be effective on both transparent layers above the flats or on layers that have full paint, like actual more traditional type of painting, then you may want to have both the amount of paint and the density of paint show up in the tool properties so you can control them on the fly. So now let's compare running color to blend. I'm going to switch to blend, and notice here that we see in the stroke that blend kind of carries over a little bit. So as I lay down the paint, notice that it does carry over some. And if I go in the opposite direction, the transparency will actually carry over into the other paint area. That may seem a little counterintuitive, but you can see the behavior on the stroke. As I switch over, you can see that it does tell you what's going to happen. So I'll bring up the sub-tool detail a little bit more, and now it may be a little bit more clear about what this stroke is showing you. This gray area is showing you what happens when you're on paint, when there's paint already down on your layer. And over here is what it looks like when there's transparency on the layer. So now let's take a look at color stretch. So I'm going to put that up a little bit and paint down here with running color. And you see that it does show up a little bit here. Let's put it on blend. And it carries, it's a little bit easier to see with blend that it takes a while for the density setting to take over. So that color does carry over quite a bit. Let's decrease that stretch. And we see that the greater your stretch is, the longer that the color carries over. Now let's go back to the fully painted layer. Notice the amount of paint is all the way up. Color stretch doesn't have any effect. Remember, we said that the density really doesn't affect anything if the layer is fully painted. And if the amount of paint is all the way up, it's fully painting the whole time. And just to confirm that, I'll drop the color stretch down, and you see it doesn't really have an effect. But now let's reduce the amount of paint. And here we have color stretch very low, and you'll see that it stretches down a little bit, but then very quickly it goes to mixing just blue with yellow. Now let's increase the color stretch, and you'll see that that pink is carried over for quite a while. Now let's take a look at an interesting thing that happens when you have the amount of paint and density all the way down. Again, density doesn't matter, but the amount of paint all the way down. And now I have color stretch going on. I have the blend mode. I'm going to go from yellow into pink. And now let's switch to the running mode. Yellow into pink. Notice that, like we've seen before, the running mode doesn't quite go as far. Let's go in the opposite direction. So when you turn the amount of paint down, it's going to pick up that paint color and the one that's underneath and carry it across. So to an extent, you can think of amount of paint as mixing the primary color that's in your brush with the paint that's on the canvas, and then it's filling up your brush as well as mixing and carrying it across to the next color. And if we go back to the layer that's partially painted and partially transparent, set the density of the paint all the way down and have the color stretch turned on, we have that same behavior that you might expect from looking at the other, the painted layer. So now if you think about this for a second, what you'll find out is that what we're actually doing when we turn the density and paint down, we're actually kind of blending the existing layers. So this is how you can create a blend brush. It's also how you can create the paint and apply brush. So now if you look at the paint and apply brush, you can understand that. So let's look at the actual paint and apply brush. Amount of paint and density are set high, but it's the pen pressure curves that we need to really look at. So when I bring that up, notice that there's a large region that there is no paint being applied. So that's as if the amount of paint or density of paint is turned all the way down. And then it rapidly increases once you start pressing on the brush. Same thing is true for the density of paint curve. They have the same kind of curves. And so what's happening is when the pen pressure is very light, the amount of paint and the density of paint is zero, and so you're just blending the existing paint. But then when you increase the pressure on the pen, then we start applying the amount of paint or the density of the paint. And of course the color stretch helps that to carry it over. We haven't talked about the intensity of blur yet, but to see that we have to actually narrow the gap. So let's look at how narrowing the gap affects these other things, and then we'll look at the intensity of blur. So we still have the amount of paint and density of paint down, and it has the effect that you would expect, which is just to mix the existing colors. The same thing is also true if we mix or we paint on top of that layer that is fully painted. So now let's take a look at the layer that's partially painted and partially transparent. And I'm going to increase the density of the paint. Notice that our paint color is blue. And I'm going to start on the pink area. And as I paint, oh, you may have thought that we should have blue here. But remember, it's kind of the idea that you're loading up the brush, that you're painting on wet paint, and it's kind of picking it up and dragging it. And notice it just keeps going and going and going. Now I'm going to set the amount of paint about halfway up and paint again. And we have a much bluer hue here. And that's because the dabs, if you look right here, they still are that purplish color, but there's so many of them that they combine together to be an increased amount of paint and give that blue overriding color. So if you want to see more of that mixing, you actually have to have a lower amount of paint. Find a good amount here. And now you see that mixing as you change it. And that's why pen pressure will really affect this quite a bit. Okay, now we can turn our attention to the intensity of blur. Now that we've talked about having the amount of paint and the density of paint down, remember that just blends the existing colors. So I'm going to go here to the layer that has 2 tones of paint, and the intensity of blur is fairly high. I'm using running color, and we've got this fixed value. And notice as I pull this across, we see this kind of blurring. Now I'm going to reduce that, and we hardly see anything. Let's go back to a middle. And you see basically it's controlling the amount or how much of the circular area is actually being blended or blurred. And of course we get the same kind of effect even if we have transparency on the layer. So here with the intensity of blur at 2.7, we get this amount of blurring, and I can increase it and get much larger radius. And so the final thing is just to apply pen pressure. I've got amount of paint about halfway up, and I add pen pressure, just a normal curve. And we can see as I press lightly, it blends, and I push in, there's more and more paint, and lift up, and so you get this kind of blurring on the edges. And as I come across, I can just blur here with very lightly because that's mixing, and then applying more paint as I push down. Now we've been just showing a circle brush tip, but of course that works with any material. And just make sure you've got density if you want to paint on the transparent area, and both of them underneath with the pressure curves. And so we can just see whether I've got color throughout the entire layer, or if I have some transparency, it paints the way we might think, and we can mix those colors. So I hope that was helpful. Pretty long video, lots of difficult things, but hopefully by watching it you've learned quite a bit about how the color mixing works in Clip Studio Paint. Enjoy painting.